Firstly, I want to thank Jacob House for recommending this case. Now on with the video. On the 15th of July 1992, 23-year-old Rachel Nickell was walking with her 2-year-old son in Wimbledon Common in London. She was then attacked in a frenzy, being stabbed almost 50 times and sexually assaulted, with her 2-year-old being found trying to wake his mother up. It's a crime that shocked the nation, and Rachel's face is one of the most recognised victim photographs in recent UK criminal history. The police completely botched the investigation, putting all their resources into forcing a confession from a completely innocent man, Colin Stagg, who was vilified in the press. Instead, the real killer, Robert Napper, an extremely disturbed and dangerous man, as well as a serial rapist, was free to walk the streets. This was the second time he'd avoided being caught, with a mistake by the police failing to link him to a rape he confessed to a family member almost 3 years before Rachel's murder. However, Napper's reign of terror would continue, and in 1993 he committed a truly horrific crime, murdering 27-year-old Samantha Bissett before raping and murdering her daughter, who was just 4. He then mutilated Samantha's body, taking at least one piece with him. The details of his crimes are almost beyond belief. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Robert Clive Napper was born on the 25th of February 1966 in London and grew up in Plumstead, an area in the southeast of the city. Napper's childhood was horrific and began with him being exposed to frequent violence between his father Brian and his mother Pauline. Also witnessing this abuse was Napper's younger brothers and their sister. Brian would eventually leave the family home, abandoning the family when Napper was around 9 years old. Napper showed signs of mental illness at an early age. It's documented that his mother, Pauline, became increasingly concerned about her son's behaviour. He would often be explosively aggressive for no reason, going from calm one minute to launching into a frenzy of violence towards his brothers the next. He would also spy on his sister when she was undressing or taking a shower. Pauline later recalled an occasion where she woke up in the middle of the night to find that her bed covers had been pulled back and Napper was stood by the side of the bed, watching her, whilst not saying a word, with a blank expression on his face. He would also begin eavesdropping on conversations between his family members, and especially when they were on the phone. He would then accuse them of making up stories about him. Napper was also extremely dishonest, and is said to have been a pathological liar. Napper and his siblings were taken into foster care when he was around 10 years old. I'm unsure why this occurred, but I imagine it had something to do with the abuse in the home, which was likely far worse than I've briefly summarised, but I have no further information. Napper was assessed by the Mental Health Service, and found to have been much more greatly affected than his siblings by the abuse. And, whilst all 4 children had psychiatric treatment, this was more intensive and went on for longer for Napper. Napper was isolated and lonely in school, and children avoided him because of his odd behaviour and strange mannerisms, and it got to the point where he was, quote, despised. One of his former classmates later stated, quote, "No one wanted to sit next to him in class. He didn't have any friends. He was teased a lot about his spots. In a game of football once, when he headed the ball, the game stopped because no other boy would go near the ball after it touched his forehead." Napper's already concerning personality and demeanour became even worse when he himself was the victim of a sickening sexual attack. This happened when he was 12 years old on a family holiday, with him being raped by a male family friend. This man was later sent to prison for this attack. After this, Napper turned in on himself. He became introverted, obsessively tidy and reclusive. His concerning behaviour towards his siblings increased in frequency. Napper left school aged 16 with some qualifications, but drifted from job to job. He was a man who didn't like to work and struggled to hold down a position. He mainly undertook manual labour jobs, including working in a warehouse. He continued to live in the family home until he was 21 years old, when he moved into his own bedsit. His first brush with the law came in August 1986, when Napper was 19 years old, and he was given a conditional discharge and a small fine for having an air rifle in public. However, whilst this was a minor offence, in secret, Napper was stockpiling weapons, including guns, ammunition and knives. Some of his cache of weapons he would bury in local parks and then return to later. He was also planning sex attacks against women and went on extensive reconnaissance of the local area, making detailed notes in an A to Z and a notepad about locations of areas he could hide, isolated paths, surveillance spots, places he could hide weapons, as well as routes to and from potential rape sites. Napper chose an area known as the Green Chain Walk as his hunting ground. The Green Chain Walk is a string of leafy pathways linking large parts of southeast London, including Plumstead, where Napper lived. Robert Napper is believed to have attempted to rape at least 2 teenagers around this area in 1987, and one of the first rapes he almost certainly committed occurred in October 1989, when he disclosed to his mother Pauline that he'd raped a woman somewhere around Plumstead Common. His mother immediately called the police, but because no cases matched the details of the offence that was reported exactly, they did not investigate further. It looks as though they looked specifically for offences that occurred on the Common. What they didn't look at was offences that occurred on the edge of the Common. If they had, they would have seen a recent report about a man having broken into a house which backed onto the Common and raping a 30-year-old woman in front of her 2-year-old son. Between 1991 and 1994, Robert Napper committed between 70 and 100 sexual offences against women and children, and, until he was identified, he was known as the Green Chain Rapist. Napper's attacks were characterised by extreme violence. They were blitz attacks, where he would appear from nowhere and use surprise and sheer force to overpower his victims and subject them to horrifying sexual attacks. In March 1992, he attacked a 17-year-old girl and tried to rape her at knife point, but he was disturbed and ran off. Another victim, later identified as C, was attacked on the 24th of May 1992. On this date, she was 22 years old and was walking to a barbecue along the Green Chain Walk in Eltham, southeast London, whilst pushing her 2-year-old daughter in her buggy. Suddenly, she became aware of someone following her and then approaching her at speed. Napper had been hiding, waiting in the undergrowth. Napper grabbed C with force and placed a ligature around her neck, pulling her to the ground. She was then stripped, raped and beaten savagely around the head. She later described being thrown around like a rag doll and begging the man not to kill her. As quickly as he appeared, Napper left the scene. The savagery of the rapes committed by Robert Napper was escalating quickly, and, while C was lucky to escape with her life, less than 2 months later, he would commit a horrific murder which would shock the nation. Rachel Jane Nickell was born on the 23rd of November 1968, and, in July 1992, she was a 23-year-old mother to 2-year-old Alex. She was living with her partner and the father of Alex, Andre Hanscom, in Wimbledon, southeast London. At around 10:20 a.m. on the 15th of July 1992, Rachel was walking her dog Molly through Wimbledon Common whilst carrying Alex. They were in an area which was partly concealed, but still only 200 yards away from other people and dog walkers. From nowhere, Robert Napper emerged and knocked Alex to the floor before attacking Rachel. Napper then began a frenzied attack, stabbing Rachel at least 49 times, including inflicting wounds to her chest, back and neck, with these last wounds being delivered with such force that Rachel was almost decapitated. He also slit her throat. Napper then pulled down Rachel's jeans and underwear and sexually assaulted her. The pathologist later stated it appeared that a finger or other object was inserted into her anus. Her bra had been removed to expose her nipples, and there were knife marks on her t-shirt and bra. The attack lasted literally minutes before Napper fled the scene. As if the crime itself was not horrific enough, Alex thought his mum was just asleep, and apparently used pieces of paper which had fallen from her pockets to try and mop up the blood on her face. Soon after the attack, a passerby found Alex next to the mutilated body of his mother, repeating over and over again, quote, "Wake up, mummy." I'm going to play a clip of Alex talking about the murder of his mother as an adult in 2017. I do want to highlight, as an aside, the disgusting behaviour of the press when he and his father were visiting the place where his mother was murdered.
I remember everything, waking up, waving goodbye to my father as he drove off in his motorbike to go to work. I remember, walking hand in hand with my mother along Wimbledon Common, with Molly running around close to us, yes. And then as we ventured deeper into the trees, there was a section that was covered by trees. So all of a sudden, we both sensed that there was something in the air. So we both turned our heads to the right quickly, and all of a sudden we saw this man lunging forward with a black bag over his shoulder. And then, everything just happened. In a matter of seconds, I was grabbed, thrown to the floor, my face dragged across the mud, and seconds later my mother collapsed next to me. And then I saw him disappear as I was lifting myself up from the floor still, because it all happened so quickly. Then he just disappeared into the distance, like it was a ghost, you know, disappearing. And I stood over my mother and I said, "Mommy, please get up." So she didn't move. So I was thinking, why doesn't she move? Why doesn't she respond? And then I said it again, "Mommy, please get up." And then it hit me, you know, right at that moment. I understood, I made that connection that she was gone and she was never coming back. So my heart was completely broken, you know. You feel that very physically in your heart.
So what kind of person was your mother?
For me, more than anything that she, you know, anything that we might have done together, what she looked like, what she smelled like, any of these things is the feeling of being loved and of loving in return. That's something that will always be with me. And regardless of me losing her under these circumstances at such a young age, I've always felt so privileged compared to so many others who have never had that experience of being loved and of loving in return.
How did your father explain your mother's death to you?
So the fact that I was there, I'd already understood it all in my mind. There wasn't much for my father to say. But even so, when he came to collect me at the hospital, you know, as he had me in his arms, he said, "Your mother is gone and she's never coming back. But we're going to continue on together, you know."
One of the most intense moments when you went to the Common,
Right.
supposedly privately,
Yes.
with your father. And by this stage, the press were after you.
Yes. All the reporters that were on the other side of the fence realized who we were. So they all came jumping over the fence. My father had to cover my face with a baseball cap and tried to run off as we were jostled, you know, from both sides, and the detectives tried to stop them from coming. And when we actually reached the spot, they put me on the ground, and we left the rose on the spot. And for several minutes, I stood watching my father as he was crying, you know, filled with tears. Meanwhile, my eyes were dry, and I was just standing there, you know, observing him.
Why do you think the press was so desperate to get to you?
The archetype of a young child with his mother, and him being there while his mother was attacked and witnessing all of that. I think there were so many elements that people identified themselves with that, you know, everyone was moved by the story. So the story blew up so much that, you know, the press is a business. We like to think that the press is some kind of news service, but the press is a private run business with their own agenda. So that was what served them as far as selling newspapers.
The murder of Rachel Nickell was horrific. A young mother attacked in a public park, slaughtered in front of her young son. The Metropolitan Police were under a huge amount of pressure to catch the murderer, with the press and the public demanding results, understandably. The police questioned 32 men quickly, and they turned to a criminal profiler for help. This man was Dr. Paul Britton. He was a highly respected psychologist who worked with the police on various high-profile cases, including the crimes of Fred and Rose West. He was asked to come up with a profile of the murder of Rachel Nickell, and he deduced that the man, quote, would be a sexually repressed loner who lived on his own close to the scene of the crime. He'd be in his 20s or 30s with an interest in the occult and in knives. Quickly, the focus turned to a man called Colin Stagg, who was 29 years old and lived a short distance from the Common, where he would come most days to walk his dog. He was in the park at the time when Rachel Nickell was murdered. Colin was unemployed, a loner, and appeared to have significant social difficulties. He also identified himself as a pagan. Police received information that Colin had corresponded with a woman through a Lonely Heart ad in which he'd shared graphic sexual fantasies. One person apparently also said that Colin was the man in the e-fit the police had produced of someone seen running away from the scene. Colin was somewhat odd, but he wasn't known to the police. However, they became convinced that he was their man, and they spent considerable resources and employed underhanded tactics to get him to confess. Dr. Britton was consulted, and he suggested that if a woman were to befriend Colin and feign interest in violent sexual fantasies, he might end up admitting to the murder of Rachel Nickell. To be clear, there was no actual physical evidence tying Colin to the murder. So, the police launched Operation Esdal with the specific focus of getting Colin Stagg to confess to the murder. This involved an undercover female police officer using the alias Lizzie James befriending Colin in the way that Dr. Britton suggested. Lizzie spent 5 months communicating with Colin via letter, phone calls and in person, but he didn't disclose anything. Dr. Britton indicated that she needed to express her sexual interest in violence in order for him to reciprocate. So Lizzie told Colin about the best sex she'd ever had, being when she was engaged in a satanic ritual where a human sacrifice had been made. Rather than being turned on by this, Colin was disgusted. Lizzie covertly recorded a conversation between her and Colin, in which she told him about her love of hurting people. Colin was heard to say, quote, "Please explain, as I live a quiet life. If I've disappointed you, please don't dump me. Nothing like this has happened to me before." Lizzie went on and said, quote, "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder, if only you had killed her, it would all be alright." And Colin responded, quote, "I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't." Despite absolutely no evidence of his guilt, Dr. Britton apparently told the police that the correspondence with Colin confirmed to him that he was indeed the killer, and he was arrested on August 17th, 1993, and charged with Rachel's murder. He was then remanded into prison to await his day in court. After spending 13 months behind bars, Colin Stagg appeared at the Old Bailey for trial in September 1994. The trial collapsed almost immediately when it became clear there was no evidence against Colin, and the police had basically manipulated a lonely man who had made no real admissions of anything. The judge said the tactics of the police were, quote, "deceptive conduct of the grossest kind." Colin was released, but he was vilified in the press. Everyone was convinced that because he got to the stage of being tried, he was guilty. His life was ruined. Just to put the boot in, the police later announced that they weren't looking for anyone else in connection with Rachel's murder. So basically they were saying, yeah, we may have fucked up, but he is the murderer. The lead detective in the case, Keith Pedder, even went so far as to go on television until the early 2000s, reaffirming the fact that he was convinced Colin Stagg was guilty, with him saying in one of these interviews, with regards to the case being thrown out, quote, "I do not believe the system served anybody that particular day." It was not until Robert Napper was finally revealed as the killer in 2008, 15 years after his ordeal began, that Colin Stagg was vindicated by the courts and the press, but his life by this point had been destroyed. In 2008, he was given £706,000 in compensation by the state in damages for the way he'd been treated. That's a lot of money, but does it really make up for so many years of vilification? However, the mistakes made with Colin Stagg were not the only errors which left Robert Napper at liberty to stalk and rape women and commit a truly horrific double murder before finally being caught. In August 1992, so the month after he murdered Rachel Nickell, one of Napper's neighbours called the police and said that he believed that Robert Napper looked like a photo fit of the green chain rapist the police had circulated. Detectives went to Napper's house, questioned him, and asked him to come and give a blood sample at the police station. He didn't turn up. Nothing was done about this. A month later, a separate person called the police and said exactly the same thing. The police again told Robert Napper to come to the police station so they could take a blood sample and obtain his DNA. He again failed to turn up. However, the police decided not to pursue this further, as they believed that Robert Napper was not the rapist. Why? Because of the description of the rapist's height. The rapist was described as being around 5'7", and the police eliminated anyone over the height of 6 foot from their suspect list. Napper was 6'2". So a few things. Firstly, I don't know about you, but I can barely judge height. I couldn't tell you to the nearest inch how tall someone is, so relying on this particular detail seems crazy to me. Also, no one seems to take into account that Robert Napper walked with a stoop, so generally looked shorter than he would if he stood up straight. Police then received another phone call, and this one they actually acted on. This call was a tip-off that Robert Napper likely had weapons, including a gun in his bedsit. His property was raided on the 27th of October 1992, and police recovered a pistol, 244 rounds of ammunition, 2 hunting knives, a crossbow, and 6 crossbow bolts. They also found maps with markings on the locations of his attacks. A notebook was also found, detailing various attacks and methods of restraining women. There were no names, just vague descriptions, but next to one of these women, he'd written, quote, "sodden filthy bitch." In one of the A to Zs was a fitness card for a young blonde woman, It was placed in the page corresponding to her home address. It's clear that Napper had stalked her. So you have a man, a loner, with an obsession with weapons, who lives in an area on the Green Chain Walk, with notes indicating that he'd stalked and attacked women. Alarm bells should have been ringing. However, Napper was arrested and sent to court solely on weapons charges. He was assessed by a mental health professional who said that Napper was a dangerous man who posed an immediate threat to the public. Despite this, he was simply jailed for 12 weeks and no further inquiries were made. In April 1993, a gun was found buried on Winds Common, South East London. The weapon was found to have Napper's fingerprints on it, but no action was taken. In July 1993, Robert Napper was spotted acting strangely close to the Green Chain Walk. He was apparently watching women and potentially following them. He was released after having a brief conversation with an officer who wrote in his notebook that Napper, quote, should be considered a possible rapist. It doesn't look like anything was done with this note. I've literally lost track of the number of missed opportunities I've outlined so far. So, as well as murdering Rachel Nickell, Napper continued to subject women to horrific sexual attacks, attacking at least one woman a month. However, he wished to kill again. In November 1993, he would kill 2 people, including a child, in the most horrific fashion. This part of the video is disturbing and includes graphic descriptions of the murder of a woman and a child, so please skip to the next chapter if you'd rather not hear this. So in 1993, Samantha Bissett was 27 years old and the mother of a 4-year-old daughter called Jazmine, with them living together in a flat in Heathfield Terrace in Chiswick in southwest London. Samantha didn't have curtains in her flat, and so anyone could look in, and unfortunately, one of these people was Robert Napper. It's clear they'd been watching her for some time, learning her routine, working out the days and times when her boyfriend Conrad would come round. On the morning of the 3rd of November 1993, Robert Napper knocked on the door of Samantha's flat. It seems she opened the door willingly, and as soon as there was an opening, Napper took it. He forced his way in and immediately began a frenzied attack against Samantha in the hallway. She was stabbed around 20 times in the head and the neck, with the blows being delivered with considerable force, including one that cut her spine. With Samantha either dead or dying, Napper went to Jazmine's room, raped her, and then suffocated her. He left her with her toys arranged around her body. Napper then returned to Samantha. He then spent hours mutilating her body. He cut her body open from the chest down to her navel, and then pulled her ribs apart and began stabbing her internal organs before removing them with his hands. He also peeled her skin off in some areas and cut away chunks of flesh which he left scattered around the room. He also cut open the top of Samantha's right thigh and attempted to remove the right leg at the knee, but could not cut through the bone. Robert Napper cut away a part of Samantha's abdomen and took it away with him as a trophy. He then posed her on a cushion before leaving. In total, Samantha had been stabbed more than 70 times. Samantha's boyfriend Conrad let himself into the flat the next day and was confronted with a scene of absolute carnage. He later described what he saw, quote, "The first thing I saw was a stain on the carpet, which turned out to be Sam's blood. I couldn't tell, so I thought Jazmine had knocked paint over. I went to the kitchen to find something to clean it up with, and found the floor was covered in Sam's clothes. I thought there had been a burglary. I walked into the front room and saw Sam. It was a pile of clothes and blankets with her arms and legs sticking out. It took me a while to realise what had happened. I was in shock. I went to phone the police and suddenly thought, what about Jazmine? I looked in the bedroom. I could see she was in bed with the duvet pulled over her. I just stood outside and chain smoked until the police arrived. I couldn't really understand it all. I don't know how you're supposed to react to something like that." Whether Conrad ever got over the loss of Samantha, or Jazmine, a child he said he loved as though she was his own, or what he saw that day, is unclear. The police attended, and the horror of the scene caused significant psychological distress to those who were forced to see it. An experienced crime scene photographer had to take 2 years off work because of what he had seen. An investigation was started immediately. Dr. Britton, it's that name again, was consulted about whether he believed that these murders were linked to the killing of Rachel Nickell the year before. Dr. Britton ruled out this possibility. Police got a break when a fingerprint was found in the flat belonging to Robert Napper, and he was finally arrested On the 17th of May 1994, footprints from shoes he owned were also found at the murder scene. A DNA sample was taken, and this identified him as the green chain rapist. On the 9th of October 1995, Robert Napper appeared at the Old Bailey in London, where he pleaded guilty to the manslaughters of Samantha and Jazmine Bissett, as well as 2 attempted rapes and 1 rape linked to the attacks on the Green Chain Walk. The manslaughter pleas were on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Essentially, Napper committed the double murders, but he should not be held fully criminally liable for doing this because his mental functions were diminished or impaired because of his underlying mental illness. Napper was assessed by a psychiatrist and found to be a paranoid schizophrenic who also suffered from Asperger's syndrome. I'll go into a bit more detail about Napper's mental health later, but it was concluded that his illness was such that it was deemed to be a significant factor as to why he committed the offences, and so his plea was accepted. It was clear that Robert Napper was too dangerous to ever be in society again, and so he was confined to hospital indefinitely. Indefinitely, in this case, inevitably meant for the rest of his life, and he was sent to Broadmoor High Security Hospital. In 2001, a new investigative team re-examined the murder of Rachel Nickell, and, due to advances in DNA testing, they were able to find DNA on evidence found at the scene, which had been in storage for 9 years. The DNA belonged to Robert Napper. He was interviewed at Broadmoor Hospital, but he denied any involvement in her death. However, this made little difference. All of the pieces of the puzzle, which had been missed for so many years, were all brought together, and, on the 4th of December 2007, Robert Napper, the right man this time, was charged with the murder of Rachel Nickell. On the 18th of December 2008, Robert Napper was again at the Old Bailey in London, where, 16 years after her death, he pleaded guilty to the manslaughter of Rachel Nickell on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Robert Napper was again assessed and was found to be a man with extremely distorted attitudes and beliefs. He believed he had a master's degree in maths, had won the Nobel Peace Prize, and had been given medals for bravery whilst fighting in Angola, and had millions of pounds stashed away in a secret bank account. He also had beliefs that he was justified in slaughtering and raping women. Doing this contributed to his overall delusions of grandeur, that he was better than everyone else. He was a sexual sadist, meaning the pain of others gave him sexual arousal and gratification. Unfortunately, the police's failure to catch Napper had led him to feel, quote, powerful and almost untouchable, reinforcing his disturbed perception that he was entitled to do these things. The outcome was exactly the same as before. Robert Napper was sent back to Broadmoor to continue spending the rest of his life in confinement, but this time, at least Rachel's family knew who had killed her, and that he would never darken the streets again. From what I've read, Napper is despised in Broadmoor, where he remains to this day, now aged 57. He has, for years, bragged about his crimes and demanded recognition for what he sees as his accomplishments. I'm not going to say much more here, as I've already gone over the aspects of Napper's mental health, which was relayed in court. He was, by any definition, an extremely dangerous man, not only because of the nature of the offences, but also his level of planning. He was meticulous in his preparation for his crimes, attacking women literally within moments of them being in a secluded area of large public parks, because he scouted out these areas days, weeks, months, or even years before the attacks. It's terrifying to think of these women, in fact any man, woman or child, going about their day completely unaware they're being watched by a sick, sadistic predator. Robert Napper's delusions of grandeur enabled him to see his victims as ants, thinks he could control and destroy at will, with him taking sadistic pleasure in watching their pain. He spent a significant amount of time eviscerating and posing Samantha Bissett's body. This was no doubt to cause as much horror to those who saw it as possible, which was the effect it had, understandably. I think it's terrible the inaction of the police fed into Napper's illness. He was literally raping women on a monthly basis, had slaughtered a woman in a public park, had been caught with guns, knives and crossbows, had confessed to being a rapist, and nothing had happened. This must have led Napper to feel like he was some sort of god and that he would never be caught. The police inaction was pivotal to the crimes of Robert Napper. It gave him the confidence to continue and escalate his behaviour. If he hadn't been caught, I've no doubt he would have kept on killing. This was a heavy case, but I think a really interesting one. To be clear, I don't make videos about cases to specifically not professionals, but it does seem like the more serious offenders I look into, the more massive failings I find from those people given the responsibility for protecting us. Anyway, please let me know your thoughts about this case in the comments. If you like what I do here, then please consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, which is £2.99 a month, or around $4. You get early access to videos and an icon next to your name. Also, please consider sending a super thanks, which is a one-off payment to support the channel. Please like, share and subscribe. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.